I'd like to spend about 15 minutes talking to Professor Meenakshi about her current research and upcoming book. And after that, we will start a Q&A session. I'd like to mention that we have our other contemporary greats like Sri Michel Danino, Konrad Elst, Srinivasan Kalyan Ramanji also on the webinar today. My namaste to them. In fact, Michel Danino ji just sent a message which I'd like to read out. He says, I would just like to record here my deep appreciation and admiration for Meenakshi's work, which I have been privileged to follow for some 2 decades. Of her steadfastness in isolation, her intellectual integrity and courage, her meticulous research and invariably dignified expression. She has done incredible service to Indian history. There is no level playing field in academics, so it was to be expected that her work would be met with a wall of silence. But in the long term, it hardly matters. Her work will outlive that of those to whom we may give the COVIDly correct label of sanitizers. We need honest scholarship, and it is rarer than ever. Meenakshi's rich legacy is assured and far from over. Thank you, Michelle, for this message. Thank you very much. In fact, I myself, when I started developing an interest in, reading more about Indian history, and when I was looking for books, I suddenly realized the absolute lack of, any serious books other than the initial days of maybe 1940s and 50s, when there was some amount of work that was done. Hardly any work available at all. And when even our children's books today, if you see, after the prehistorical description from literature, like the Aryan invasion, so-called, Aryan invasion, which never happened, or the Harappan civilization, all the way to the first century BC or the 2nd century BC, there's absolutely a complete blank of what exactly has happened. There is no clarity. It's as if almost that after the Harappan civilization, the whole subcontinent has been depeopled. That's that there's nobody around, that nothing has happened. There's hardly any mention of any detail in our children's books, and there's hardly any books that are available which give credible information about the history of our people during this era. And even some very important subjects like, for example, what is the origin of temple building in India? What is the origin of image worship in India? On these subjects as well, there's hardly anything that is written. In fact, the leftist historians have successfully completely ignored and been silent. No matter how much they would have wanted to probably comment on, the most recent historians like Sitaram Goel and even Konrad Elst and some of the others, but because of some of Meenakshi's work, they could not stay away. For example, her NCERT CBSE textbook that she has written, Middle in India. So they had to comment on it, they had to criticize it, right? And they had to, in fact, I have seen some of the criticisms where they acknowledge, that yes, yeah, this is good work, but these are the problems, and they come up with all kinds of very silly criticisms in terms of, for example, this name should be spelled with an I, but she has spelled it without an I. This is a kind of a criticism they have for Meenakshi's Medieval India, CBSE textbook. And of course, her review of Romila Thapar Somanath has also, really affected them quite a bit, and I've seen them respond to it quite a bit as well. I'd like to now quickly, I have several questions myself, and probably I'll ask them after this brief discussion on Meenakshi's current work. So I had a small telephone call with Meenakshi to talk to her about what could be a good thing to discuss here. And she explained to me that her current research is in 2 areas. One is, and both of them are early Indian history. The first topic that she's that currently occupies her research is the centrality of image worship for Indians and the earliest evidence that is available for image worship in India. And she has sent me a paper, which talks about Vasudeva, Krishna's worship. And she's also currently, working on foreign invaders and foreign visitors, whether it is Indo-Greeks or Shakas or Kushans, coming into northwestern India pre-Islam, right? What was the attitude of Indians towards them? Who were called Mlechas and who were not called Mlechas, right? What was the status of the rulers of Indians, who have come from outside? And how did the lawgivers of India, deal with the society and the polity in those days? Specifically, for example, what Al-Biruni from 11th century, has written about this specific issue of what Indians' attitude was towards, such people. So these are the two areas that Meenakshi ji mentioned. So Meenakshi ji, about the earliest image worship, this particular research area that you mentioned. So you mentioned in your paper that there is actual evidence from, I think, literary evidence from 3rd to 4th century BCE, and also archaeological evidence from 1st to 2nd century BCE. And I don't know, I have heard that the earliest standing temple that we have today is probably from 5th century AD, right? And I have also seen references to temples, for example, in works like Ardhashastra, which talks about devalayas to be built in the middle of durgas and forts. And I don't know whether you will agree with me or not, but if you read Ramayana, when the scene that is being described where Sita and Rama are going on the river, after the beginning of their stay away from Ayodhya, there's a description of devalayas on both sides of the river, on the banks. So is temple building obviously is related to image worship as well, and probably there is more to image worship than temples as well, both ways to it. But Ramayana is a much older work. Do you think there were temples at that time as well? I'd like to hear more about you, more from you about this particular area of your research.
See, the Vedic period, in the Rig Veda, there is no reference to image worship, because in the Vedic period, the offerings that were made to God were through the sacrificial fire. So sacrifice was the most important, and Agni was the medium by which you sent your offerings to God. But in the Upanishads, we have for the first time mention of the word bhakti. And bhakti is devotion to your personal God. And scholars have traced the beginning of image worship to bhakti. Now, the earliest evidence that we have, actually literary evidence, is Panini. Panini mentions worship, but he does not specify the deities who are under worship. But he uses certain terms. And Patanjali, who comments on Panini's work, says that Panini, when he's talking about this, when he's talking about Vasudev, he means not Vasudev who was the Kshatriya, but Vasudev who's the worshipful one, the adorable one. So from the time of Panini, we have references to images and image worship. After that, it is very easy to document. The first epigraphic evidence that we have is provided by a Greek ambassador to an Indian court. Now, this Greek ambassador to the court of an Indian prince in the 2nd century before Common Era, he comes to India and he erects a column, the Garud, which is called the Garud Dhwaj, in honor of Vasudev, the god of gods. Vasudev, is Krishna. So that column is still standing. The inscription on that column is standing. That inscription is important because it is the first surviving epigraphic evidence which attests to worship of image. And just one more thing I want to say about this inscription. This inscription is in two parts. The verse, part 2, has a verse which is exact replica of a verse in the Stri Parv of the Mahabharata, which means that this Greek ambassador coming from Takshila was aware of the Mahabharata before he came to India. And the Mahabharata itself says that Vyas ordered that the Mahabharata should be first recited in Takshila. So the Mahabharata is itself saying it was first recited in Takshila, and all the people who were assembled at that gathering heard it and took it to their various parts. And Panini lived in a place very near Taxila. So it all ties up. Now, you talked about temples. In the 1960s, Indian archaeologists excavated near this Vesgar inscription of Heliodorus. It's called the Heliodorus inscription. They excavated around it in the 1960s. And they found evidence of a structure, a sacred structure that was destroyed by floods or something soon after it was constructed, and a stone structure created at that site. And the remnants of that stone structure, which is like a temple, not a grand temple, but a small temple of the before common era, are there for us to see. So this is before common era, small structures that we can call temples we have at Besnagar, and then we have at a place called Nagri in Rajasthan. In Nagri also we are fortunate that we have found a partial inscription which says that this is being created for Vasudev and Sankarshan, whom we know is Vasudev's brother. There also the plan of the temple survives. It's a small plan, but it is very much there. And then these are the two earliest where the plan of the temple is surviving, both of before common era. They're separated from each other by about 30-40 years only, which means that temple construction, I'm not talking about grand temples, but modest small structures were there before the common era. And in Mathura, the most important findings are from Mathura, early common era. There also we have been fortunate to find an inscription which says that this temple with this arch, with this beam, with this bracket is being created in honor of Vasudeva. So the inscription has been found, but what is most surprising about Mathura, near the inscription, excavations were done, and the inscription says that it is in honor of the 5 Vrishni heroes. The 5 Vrishni is the clan to which Krishna belonged, and the 5 Vrishni heroes were the immediate relatives of his brother, his son, grandson, etc. So this inscription says it is for the 5 Vrishni heroes. And in 1911, when excavations were done near this site of where the inscription was found, 2 male torsos were found. Now those 2 male torsos were definitely belonging to this temple. They were, we cannot say whether they were Krishna or Sankarshan because the top and the bottom part is missing, only the torso is there, but they are definitely Vrishni heroes. And then sometime later, the pedestal of a female was found, only the legs and the pedestal was found. And from that, the scholars have concluded that it belonged to the sister of Balram and Krishna. So this is early evidence that we have of temple construction and worship of Vasudeva Krishna.
I have seen some writings, which talk about the fact that even probably during the Vedic age, if one can call it that they were probably temporary structures which were built and then probably they're taken away. So there was some sort of an image worship during that time as well. I'm not sure. But if you see, for example, the representation per se, if you take as a concept in the Harappan, one of the icons that was found, it clearly shows a representation of Shiva, right, as a Pashupati. So there may have been maybe not permanent structures, but maybe places of worship made out of wood and perishable material like that.
See, as far as that Pashupati seal is concerned, John Marshall, who wrote the most authoritative work on Mohenjo-daro, he called it Proto-Shiva. So he was very clear. Then B.B. Lal, he and S.R. Rao, they have found evidences of fire altars. And according to some archaeologists, the Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro was clearly associated with some form of worship, because it was built in such a way that you had to circumambulate around it. You could not walk on it with your, you had to walk barefoot around it. So they presume that. Now there is another archaeologist I want to mention, that is R.P. Chanda. R.P. Chanda is now, not known. His name is not known to many people. Of course, he is a respected person in academic circles. He was the first person to study that priest king, that image that you mentioned from Mohenjo-daro. And he said that this image is a person with certain characteristics. What are those characteristics? Stiff head, neck, and chest, and eyes, half closed eyes, in meditation pose, looking at the tip of the nose. And he said this posture is not found in the art of any other country in the world. But he said it is a distinct characteristic of Indian images. If you see the image of the Buddha or Jains or the Hindu deities, many of them are in this contemplative pose. Whether that priest king, we don't know. Whether he was worshipped in a temple, it's not possible to answer. But the things that he represents don't die and are manifested 3 millennium later, when Indian art begins in Mathura. So found in Indus Valley and revived in Mathura, where image making begins in the common era.
What is your opinion on the frequent, assertion that we see that image worship has actually started in Hindus from Jains? Do you think there is any substance in that?
It's very difficult to answer this question, but I'll just give you 1 or 2 examples. At Indus Valley, certain statues have been found in that stiff posture, which is the characteristic of Jain Tirthankars. Who these people were, nobody can answer. But then that same posture, that is the stiff, erect posture of Jain images. Now, images begin in Mathura, and they are almost at the same period of Jains, Buddhists, and Hindu images. And we find that this community of artisans and craftsmen, they were available to all the 3 faiths. And there's hardly a difference of 20-30 years between the earliest Buddha image and the earliest Hindu image. So we cannot say which came first, because if tomorrow is an excavation which reveals something else, but we can say they're almost at the same period and in the same region and crafted by the same artisans.
Thank you very much, ma'am. I'd like to, can I request you to quickly say a few words about your other area of research, which you mentioned to
Okay.
me on.
Okay. Actually, there are two areas of research. The first that I'm mentioning is part of this study which we have discussed. And that is that, India in this period, that is early India, it was invaded before Common Era by the Persians, the Greeks, the Shakas, the Kushans, the Huns, among others. So we have a very strong literary tradition during this period. So what does the literary, and these rulers, they ruled over significant parts of northwestern India. So what does the literary tradition say about these? So Manu says that there are actually only 4 castes in the world and the rest are derived from them. So according to this, the others are the offspring of mixed marriages, or people have become out Shudras or lower level because they had abandoned their sacred duties, sacred obligations, or not kept in touch with Brahmins. So he is not distinguishing between people who are part of this society and outsiders. Outsiders means he doesn't know of the whole world, but people who are in the vicinity, on the borders. So he says there are only 4 castes, the rest are their offspring. Offspring because either they've neglected their sacred duties or they did not keep in touch with Brahmins. And Patanjali, he says that these people, they do not have to be expelled from the dish. Do not have to be expelled from the dish means that you don't have to throw away the utensils if you have food with them. Otherwise that untouchability thing is not there. They don't have to be expelled from the dish. So this is a phenomena which you can study in the ancient texts. And I was pleasantly surprised to note Al-Biruni discussing this at great length. And he himself writes that, they had such an open attitude and they were very willing to learn from anyone. And he mentions the astronomer Vara Mihra. He came from a family outside India. They're supposed to have come from Iran. But he was given such an exalted place in this society. And Al-Biruni says that is because they did not neglect people who had knowledge. So he says, when did this attitude change? When did they start? Because they were accepting people from outside. When did this attitude change? And Al-Biruni says that it changed forever because of the traumatic experience that they had at the hands of the Turks. And he says, he himself writes that after the invasions of Mahmud Ghaznavi, Hindus became like atoms of dust scattered in all directions. And they retreated to remote areas where our arms could not reach them. So this is his. There's one more project that I'm hopefully going to work on. And that I think would also interest your, do I have time or is it over?
Please go ahead, ma'am. Yeah.
This is that, we have discussed so much about India under foreign rule, whether it's Arab rule, Turkic rule, or British rule. The point is that how did Hindu society survive? And I realized that they did not go to the state institutions for redressal or for any requirement. That means that under the rule of an Islamic state or the British state, the Hindus had no interaction except when they were forced to pay the revenue. That means their system of education, their system of justice, their judiciary, everything operated outside the state. So this is what I hope to study sometime.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Now I'd like to start the Q&A session. I request all the other panelists to switch on their videos. I would like to ask Meenakshi ji 2 questions, and after that, it's free for all. They could also ask questions. I would also like at some point to read out questions from the other participants as well. My first question to Meenakshi ji is a little personal. I was recently reading this book by Girilal Jain ji. This was actually edited by Meenakshi ji, and this was published by her in 1994. And I wanted to go back and see what were Girilal Jain ji's words about the Ayodhya movement. And I'd like to read from it, just a small paragraph. So the chapter is titled Ayodhya, a Historical Watershed. It says, 1992 will doubtless go down in Indian history as the year of Ayodhya. This is not so much because of recent events, they have pushed into the background all the other issues such as economic reforms and reservations for the other backward castes, as because they have released, this is the most important thing, they have released forces which will have a decisive influence in shaping the future of India. So I was wondering, how well he has foreseen what was going to happen, 30, 40 years.
I think it was just my good fortune and destiny that the Ram movement was the last major cause that my father took up. And though he got a lot of popular support, but he was ostracized by, his former colleagues and the profession also. And I thought it was, his blessing that I took up this work on Ayodhya, and I wrote 2 books which were widely acclaimed. And I really regard this, as Ram's blessing and my father's blessing, because this was a cause for which he really suffered in the last years of his life. And I'm really blessed that I was able to, continue with that cause. And that I've been blessed to witness the Bhumi Pujan. That is the biggest blessing.
I know. You yourself have been a rebel, and you continue to be a rebel among the historians. And in fact, I think before you published this book, you had only one book, and it was on politics at that time.
Yes,
I think you've written a book on Congress party.
Yes.
Yeah, and the caste politics.
Yeah, in the context of Mandal and all that.
Yes. Yeah. And I of course, growing up, you must be among the greats, with whom your father was, Ram Swarup ji, Sitaram Goyal ji, and all these others.
My father, Sitaram ji and Ram Swarup, they were together from first year of college. They went to college together. And then both of them were part of our family. So we used to meet all the time.
I see. Okay. Now it clearly shows. I think even your sister, I think Sandhya Jain ji, also writes quite a bit, in this area. And in fact, I was just trying to read up some of your older articles, and I found several from the Illustrated Weekly of India, a very long time ago. But one thing that stood out, it was in 1990. You had written an article, "The Plight of Brahmins."
Yes.
That was a very courageous thing to do, right about at that point in time.
Yes, I wrote a lot on Mandal politics at that time, actually. And my study showed that, this ground reality was just the opposite of what was being projected. And that the dominant castes were being projected as, weaker castes. They were not weak in the sense of economic might, So I wrote against the dominant castes at that time.
Yeah, but your initial work was on caste politics, and I think some of your work was also published in the anthology of M.N. Srinivasa's sociology work as well. So you are quite well known in your work in the sociological side of things. What made you to come into the historical, the civilizational history, side of things?
Actually, I had, I'm a slow reader. I'm a silent worker. So I was, reading for ages. And I was really also quite, bewildered that is this reading going to lead to anything? But, so I just spent so many years of my life just reading and marking books. And, and somehow suddenly things fell in place. You have to have that. Sometime it happens that you just see that now it's the right time and you just have to get onto it. But all my research, I must say, has been, just the opposite of what the dominant people are saying. So in that sense, I've never gone with the flow if I look back. I've always taken a stand which is somehow opposite of what the dominant strand is. So I have, in that sense, been a loner researcher. I've not had many people endorsing what I'm doing. And every book of mine, it's been a Herculean task to get it published.
Yeah.
The perils of sticking to facts and truth, I guess, Meenakshi.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask some questions, which were asked in the Q&A module. But if the other panelists have any questions, they could go ahead and ask. Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask. So I was reading some of the criticism.
One from my side, I think we can take off.
I'll just ask one question, Meenakshi.
Sure.
When can we expect your next book?
I hope by the end of next year.
Oh, fantastic. So there's more work for you, one more review to write, Abhishek.
Yes.
Absolutely, with pleasure.
Thank you.
So
Abhinav had reviewed my book Ram in Ayodhya, and I had not even known him at that time. And when somebody sent that review to me, I was so pleasantly surprised that here is a person who's actually had the courage to review my book. And after that, of course, it was a pleasure knowing him, and he has been very, very helpful in getting my books publicity and doing the reviews.
Okay. I was, in fact, ma'am, reading some of the criticism of your works by the left historians, and they don't, they keep, mentioning that, she's a communal,
Yes.
historian.
Yes.
And the reason they give, for using that label is that, you refer to the Muslim dynasties as foreigners, right? So it's very difficult to understand, how one, yes, you have talked about it today as well, but there is a question, which is related to that. Somebody has asked, Vishwajit Kumar, has asked a question. The temples destroyed by invaders are often given economic and political, reasons, as the reasons for destruction of temples. But nobody talks about the religious reasons, in these history books by these Muslim invaders in destruction of temples, right? What is your opinion on that?
The motivation was always religious. We should not try to hide from that fact. And Mahmud Ghaznavi, he was lauded in the Arab world for destroying the temples of India. And he was given the title of Sultan by the Caliph. He was the first person to be given the title of Sultan for his deeds in India. And if you want to disconnect temple destruction from the religion of Islam, then I would like to ask, how do you account for the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in the 20th century? The Bamiyan Buddhas had no economic clout attached to them. There was no wealth attached to them. Yet they were consciously destroyed because they were a symbol of a civilization which is revering in image worship, which they wanted to destroy. And just last month, in the Swat area, which fell under the control of the Taliban, they came across an old statue of Buddha. And it was a real rare piece. And there are photographs of them trampling on it and reducing it to pieces. So this is an old leftist argument that the temples were attacked because of the wealth of temples. My counter question is, when Somnath was attacked again and again and again, was it an economic motive? When Aurangzeb was 87 years old, when he was 87 years old, he sent a message to his officials in Somnath. At the age of 87, he sent a message to Mughal officers in Gujarat, please check if Hindus have revived worship in Somnath. If they have revived worship in Somnath, destroy it in such a way that it is never possible again. So at that time, was there any economic motive attached to the destruction of Somnath? For the nth time. And at the age of 87, he is passing a farman, and that is available to us.
Yeah. Ma'am, there is one more question. A quick, what was the language of administration before Akbar changes to Persian? This is a question from Abhijit.
Yes. The thing is that it was written in both sides. The order was written in both sides. It was sometimes in Persian, sometimes in Turkic, and the local language at the back. So it was in two parts.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Sri G.V. Shivakumar. Ma'am, can you please elaborate on impact of Din-e-Ilahi on then Hindu society and its impact down the lane? How did the Muslim society itself respond to it?
This Din-e-Ilahi was a non-starter. It had no impact on Hindu society. No important Mansabdar of Akbar joined it. And it petered away within a few years. Raja Man Singh, who was his closest confidant and relative, even he did not join. It was some kind of fad which did not survive for long at all.
So there's an anonymous question. Please, can you please mention the name of the French writer on textiles again? I think.
Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, Tavernier.
Okay. Yes. So there are a lot of questions related to school textbooks, and you contributed to writing the textbooks on medieval India. We have heard that there is a new committee that is being set up or has already been set up. Are you on this committee, ma'am? And are you playing any role in the textbooks that are about to be written?
No, I am playing no role. I've read in the papers about the new education policy, like all of us. But I really don't know what is the state of the new textbooks, who's writing it, who's commissioning it. I have no idea.
Okay.
Can I have a go? Just one small intervention.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Meenakshi ji. As always,
Thank you.
I just wanted to come back to my favorite topics, two topics. One is the legacy partnership that Indic Academy has started with all the eminent scholars. And I request all the people who are listening to please, 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 we have a grant, specific grant for each scholar. We have given a grant. Meenakshi ji, of course, has said that please use it for the research scholars. So we are going to give this grant for any scholar who wants to work under the tutelage of Meenakshi ji. So please approach us, write to us at namaste@indica.org.in. And we would be happy to support your research, to support Meenakshi ji's work. Please think of this as the classical music gharanas. So we need to have a Meenakshi ji gharana that we need to create more and more sishyas. And so I appeal to all of you to please write to us. That's the first thing. The second thing is, remember the Flight of Deities. We have a very interesting project wherein we are asking people to fictionalize these stories in a semi-academic manner. And we have announced Avtans, our national executive convener for US, is leading that. It's available on our website. So please do reach out to us. We need to tell these stories so that these stories can be accessed by the common person. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hurricane Garo. I'd also like to make an announcement. Indic Today. So Yogini Deshpandeji, the editor at Indic Today, she has asked me to mention that she would like to publish any articles that are written on the program today. Anybody who writes about the content of the discussions that have happened today should be glad to publish them. And there could be multiple people contributing to this, and any contributions from students and non-professionals would even be compensated. So this is Yogini Deshpande's message. So Indic Today would like to publish on this event. The other panelists, Abhinav, Hariprasadji, would you like to ask any questions? And while there are a lot of questions, I think around 87 questions that people have asked. I'm just going through them. Meanwhile, if you could just, I want to make sure that we're not leaving any important questions from this.
No, I don't have any questions. All I'll say is that it's been a privilege and educational experience and eye-opening experience in reading several of our books. From Rama and Ayodhya, The Battle for Rama, Sati, Flight of Deities, Parallel Pathways, The India They Saw. And it is, while it has been, an exhilarating experience, it is also sad in many ways, because if you read about the plight of, how our temples were destroyed, it makes for very sad reading. And what is even sadder is that 70 years after independence, these things are unknown to a majority of Indians is, I think, perhaps an even sadder tale. That our temples were destroyed is a tragedy. That we don't know much about what happened, I think, is a bigger tragedy.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's a real tragedy.
Srinivasji.
Yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, you know what exactly is going on in campuses like JNU or other university campuses? Means university environment is not means favorable for the kind of academic research you have done or the other scholars wants to do. So what about the non-university initiative? Means Indic Academy is on one side. So
you are also doing. Yes, you are also doing. I think that is you see, this is exactly the beauty of this situation, that other avenues have opened. So now you, by your institutions, will get more audience than a university classroom will get. A university classroom will get 30, 40. Whereas every event that you organize and the lectures that you organize, they're getting 150, 200 people who are coming there to listen, apart from people who watch on video. So I am personally of the opinion that you have a tremendous opportunity to go on organizing these things, because I feel that now there are no big stalwarts of the stature of the earlier. And the current leftist scholars don't have the courage or the stature to come out openly and take a stand. They will make remarks in their classroom, and the books that they write are mainly on economic or other such developments. They're not taking up key issues of culture and civilization. That space is actually vacant for us. So I think, like Swadesh, you are doing, you've got this Academics for the Nation. You've organized so many talks, and you're having an active program of training young scholars. So I think that is the way ahead. Until the universities are ready to fall on their own, we should bypass them and work on these alternative routes like you have found.
Thank you.
One quick question from me, Srinivasji, if it's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
Just wanted Meenakshiji's opinion on that. One theme that comes across in the Flight of Deities book is, obviously, because whenever there was a crisis, Hindus had lost political power. That's when the temples and deities were attacked. So it's the ordinary Hindu, the villager or the town person, he is involved in the flight of the deity.
Yes.
You know, maybe because it's his family deity, village deity, whatever is the tradition, hereditary nature. And then when on the other side, when the rebuild of the temple happens, when it is put back, inevitably the name of the ruler, the name of the king comes in. It's a theme across, you know, the 350 pages.
See, the thing is that when the temple, when the image is being removed from there, the people who are involved are naturally the priests and the local devotees. But because the deity is not a piece of furniture or something they can lock up and put it in a suitcase and travel with it. The deity has to be worshipped all along the way by certain rituals. So we find local zamindars, locally powerful people, local kings providing sustenance for the deity and the priest in their flight. So, for example, the image of Govind Dev. The image of Govind Dev was instated in the temple that Raja Man Singh had built. Govind Dev temple. Now, when Aurangzeb's order of 1669 came, then Govind Dev also fled along with other deities in Mathura, Braj, Vrindavan area. And they fled to Rajasthan because it was nearest and it was not a terrain that could be easily attacked. So we find that Govind Dev, he is finally instated in a temple in Jaipur in 1739. So from 1669 to 1739, the deity is on the move. He stays in one place for 10 days, another place for 3 weeks, another place for 2 days, but he's staying in many different places. So temporary structures are erected in those places. In many places, those temporary structures have survived till today. And the local people have instated new murtis in those structures and continue to worship there. So all along the way, you will find land grants, which are given for the deity, for his stay here. So it is, the name of the king comes because the king is the one who finally builds that grand temple. But the journey is a collective journey of the priests and the local people, and they're supported all along the way by local peasants, landlords, zamindars, whoever you want to call them.
In terms of drawing,
and the king is the one who finally gives the patronage for the big temple.
in terms of drawing lessons for today, I mean, there is a huge debate about the role of the ordinary Hindus in managing their temples versus the role of the government. I think this history, the lessons make a strong case that we should try to ensure that the attachment of the ordinary Hindu with his temple remains.
Absolutely, and that is what kept this society coherent. It did not collapse, even though it did not have political power for 1,000 years. It remained a coherent society. This was one of the reasons.
Thank you.
Yes, Srinivas ji.
Yeah, thank you very much, ma'am. I think we have short past 20 minutes past the planned end time. I think probably a lot more questions. Probably I'll send an email to you and maybe you can respond and we can publish them.
We will not, overshoot the time too much. We just within a few, I think maximum 10 minutes.
No, actually, okay. Or maybe we could, as I was proposing, maybe we could end the session now. There are a lot of questions. In fact, I will send them to you.
Yes, that will be better.
Maybe, you know, if you could respond to them, maybe Yogini ji can publish it on Indic today.
Yes, that would be better. That would be better.
So I'd like to thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for being with us here today. We didn't have a break. I hope it wasn't too uncomfortable for you to sit through almost 3.5 hours.
I enjoyed
almost 4 hours.
I enjoyed it, and thank you for the patience, and thank all the panelists who spared time and asked such intelligent and interesting questions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, ma'am. And thank you, Harikiran ji, for giving me an opportunity to conduct such wonderful sessions with great people. We have already done 3. This is the 4th. I'm really, really happy to have done this. And the recording of this would be available on YouTube and Facebook. And, I request everybody to share this as much as possible. Thank you very much. Thank you,
so much.
Meenakshi ji.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Please
Thank
send the link to me also.
Thank you, ma'am. Namaste.
YouTube link, please send me.
Sure, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Indic Academy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.